Considering Brownfield. About a year ago, so did I. I'm going to tell you my experience since and how you can consider Brownfield for your own use. My name is Ryan Turner, and I'm a newer member of the React Native Core. You've probably seen me on the changelogs and a little bit of documentation too. I also work on mobile applications at AutoZone, and we're an international automotive aftermarket retailer for parts, essentially. We help you fix your car, or we help someone fix your car for you. Last winter, we released our first Greenfield React Native application, and it was awesome. We faced the classic newcomer issues, but we also were really impressed by the performance. We'd done hybrid development in the past using other platforms, and we anticipated this as a challenge. Now, what we didn't anticipate was the kind of performance that we'd get from our developers. We found that we could do development in React Native Greenfield much faster than we were doing when we were doing platform-specific development. And as Mike mentioned, we had an existing application that had a much larger user base. And our product team had a really long backlog for it. I was faced with the question, how do we meet that backlog? How do we do it? So today, I'm going to talk about what Brownfield is, why AutoZone's doing Brownfield. I'll talk about how you can determine if Brownfield is a good fit for your use. And finally, I'll talk about what it means to take the plunge. Now, don't worry, I'm kind of warming you up for the day. I don't plan to show you any code today. There's a great talk at 10 o'clock after mine that will show you some code for use in Brownfield. But instead, I'm going to talk more about the decision-making process of should I or shouldn't I do Brownfield? And then I'm also going to talk about specifically what you need to anticipate along the lifespan of that Brownfield product, if you choose to do it. So I'm sure most of you have heard the term Brownfield before, but I imagine if I were to ask the audience to define it, there would be a few different answers. There's different perspectives on what it means. A lot of people see Brownfield as a way to add cross-platform screens to existing applications. And that's what most of the tutorials, documentation, and examples show. But Brownfield can also be a way to migrate an existing application from some other platform into React Native. And so for us, it's actually a path to transform a code base into a React Native application. The obvious thing, though, is that a Brownfield application isn't initialized using the CLI, Expo, or templates. It doesn't come from tools like that. It's a manual integration that you're doing on top of something. And so at its heart, Brownfield lets you develop React Native on something that wasn't originally React Native. And depending on how far you choose to go, it could be a technique that ends up where you have a product that's very close to what a Greenfield application would have been in the end. So with definitions aside, let me tell you why we're doing Brownfield for our application. I mentioned earlier that our product folks had a really big backlog, and essentially they were ready for an end-to-end refresh of our flagship application. And that application had millions of users, but it had been written largely in 2014, and both the Objective-C and the Java code bases had significant architectural issues. And so essentially, they were becoming a burden to maintain, and we found that the cost of implementing new functionality and even just trying to maintain feature parity with our other channels, like our website, became really difficult because we just continued to pile on more on top of the technical debt foundation that we had. Nevertheless, our product owners continued to challenge us to implement new features. We'd finally gotten to the point, though, where they understood that there was significant infrastructure work that had to take place in order to support the feature delivery timelines that they wanted. Essentially, we need to clean up the base before we could move on to building onto it. But even though our product owners were willing to compromise and say, hey, we'll give you some time, figure that stuff out, AutoZone is a company with over 6,000 stores in multiple regulatory domains. So we're dealing with regulations from the United States, Mexico, and Brazil. This flagship application, luckily enough, was just for domestic US, but if you've ever done anything for the US, you know there are a couple states that kind of stand out with some tricky regulations. And so even though our business team says, hey, we can give you 6 months off, go figure it out, they don't get to say that to the state of California, for instance, when they show up and say, hey, this new proposition says you need to now show a new detail on our product listings and on your order summary pages. And while that sounds like a pretty simple change, all of a sudden, if you're dealing with something that's crusty and old, that becomes really painful. So we wanted to do a transformation. Really, we wanted to build net new. That's how we want to be in the end. But we couldn't delay those regulatory compliance changes. And to complicate things even more, our group was small enough that we couldn't split into a legacy and a next-gen team. We really only had enough staff to support one team working on the product. And so that one team needed to simultaneously update the infrastructure, refresh the user experience, and handle those kinds of urgent business demands, all at the same time. We did have one trick up our sleeve, though. Like I mentioned, we developed that Greenfield React Native app in the past. And we found that we could deliver features much faster than when we did native development, thanks to our features being relatively consistent between both platforms. One other thing. In our organization, there were other teams already using React. And we knew that if we converged on React, our small team would benefit from a lot of the existing works of the larger organization. So we could share perhaps some standards, some tooling, and it would also make the pipeline for finding new talent and getting people to join the team a lot easier. We also had an aspiration in the long run to try to get to a shared component library and start working towards some of that code sharing between web and native that was talked about yesterday. That's a bit far off for us, but still, React Native looked pretty interesting. This was when we said, yes, let's do Brownfield. And so we said, game on. I'm excited for the new Matrix movie, sorry. Now, has anyone else been in the situation where basically you're trying to evaluate, should I do Brownfield? Should I invest in this big initiative, 6 months, 8 months, maybe it's a whole year? And essentially you're saying, this sounds good. And there's some examples of people doing it for adding a feature, but your actual objective for the project is much more ambitious. When I had to make the decision, I felt like there was a lot of uncertainty at this point, just because we didn't have any experience with it, and I didn't find a lot of examples of how they tackled some of the concerns I mentioned before. So we took the plunge and we said, yeah, this seems right, and we committed. But I think that there's some lessons that we can share from our own experiences that'll help you make a determination for yourself if Brownfield's right for you. So let's talk about that now. First, a couple of filter questions. Is your team set up to work cross-platform? And this is important because a lot of the prior publications on this issue talk about how it's a challenge if you have a team that identifies as the Android team, and then all of a sudden getting an application to production requires a whole lot more than just Android. And so essentially you need to be prepared for that team to support Android, iOS, this web tooling, and then some proprietary stuff specific to React Native. And if your developers aren't on board with that plan, you're going to face challenges in motivation. And then you're also going to have issues where who owns that tricky stuff in the middle? So you need to be set up for the team to consider that I own the entire application. Maybe I specialize in specific areas, but I need to be just as accountable for that funny Metro issue as somebody else, even if I might have in the past said, well, most of my experience is in Android. Everyone in the room bought a ticket or got a ticket somehow, and so you should already know that React Native is written in JavaScript. We've heard about that all yesterday. But something that you might not consider is how a large organization might have concerns about using JavaScript for things that aren't the traditional applications for it. And so you need to make certain, too, that your organization is aligned with using JavaScript or TypeScript or ReasonML, whatever flavor you want to use, whatever variant you want to use. You need to make certain that everyone understands you're going to shift to using that new technology for your mobile application. Because all of a sudden, you're going to need to start finding employees who have experience in this space. And some of the people who might have been giving you oversight on how you write Swift or Kotlin, they probably won't be as helpful here unless they're willing to make the change as well. And finally, is your business aligned with you doing a brownfield implementation? Now, normally I like to segment these kinds of issues as either a business issue or an engineering issue, and there's this clear line dividing those two groups. But I think when it comes to choosing platforms, it straddles both. And the rationale for that is, if you start using React Native, you are changing the paradigm for what comes easy and what is hard. And so all of a sudden, overnight, you'll find yourself choosing to favor third-party APIs or SDKs, and once again, trying to hire people who have experience in React Native. But if your business team doesn't know how to anticipate that, and maybe you're lucky enough where the business team is just you wearing a different hat, but in our organization, that's a whole different org. It's a different team. And if they don't understand what's going on, they'll be quite surprised when all of a sudden that vendor that you've been talking about doing business with for a year went from top of the list to the bottom of the list because they don't have a good React Native package, or maybe they don't have anything at all. And don't take this to mean that, hey, once you do React Native, you can't make use of those vendor libraries. That's not my point. Your cost to implement is going to change because of how you're using React Native. And now all of a sudden, that did just become a business concern. So make certain that before you take the plunge, you have business alignment that this is an idea worth implementing. Now let's talk about the benefits of React Native. Now, these aren't unique to Brownfield. You'll get all the same things for Greenfield too. But in our case, one of the options that we were considering was not doing React Native at all. So I think when you're weighing the cost of doing a Brownfield implementation, you should be concerned with what benefits could I get from being in the React ecosystem. I talked before about how for us, shared components and code reuse between web and mobile was a big factor in our considerations. And it probably should be for you too, if you have those existing properties. So can you imagine sharing components across multiple platforms? Now, what about your UI designers? In our case, we had some issues communicating between the folks telling us what it should look like and the folks actually doing the implementation. And React and React Native have lots of good tooling around this. They've got first-party integrations with a lot of design tools. So you might consider how adopting React Native will speed up that handoff between the designer and developer. Or perhaps if you're, once again, wearing both hats, it's going to make your life easier. And then finally, the other real big pro that I talked about before was the opportunity for shared tooling. If you work in an enterprise, you probably have some people who specialize on working on CI/CD pipelines. And you probably also have a lot of internal systems that, out of the box, might support web pretty well. And it's a lot more challenging, though, to find support for native applications within those ecosystems, especially, once again, if you're working with another team, because it's a really specialized skill set to work on tooling around mobile applications. So if you switch to React Native, you get a lot of the benefits of the closeness with web tech. So all these bonus questions are things that might push you from maybe I'll do Brownfield to definitely I need to. But from here, it gets much more complicated. In all Brownfield projects, you need to be concerned with, at the core of it, two things: the depth of your UI integration and the depth of your data integration. And essentially, the more UI that you implement, the more that offsets the cost of a tricky data integration. Now, this is changing, and this is something that was talked about yesterday, but once again, I'm speaking from my own experience in the past year. So I had to deal with the bridge, we had to deal with the bridge, and we found that basically when you had to have data flying back and forth from native to React Native and vice versa, it really only started to offset the cost once we were looking at a large set of functionality. I'll talk about that more in my actual suggestions at the end. In general, though, if you have a simple data integration, it's always going to be a win, because basically you pick up the benefits of working in React and just how fast that can be for your developers. Now, if you're considering using Brownfield as a way to do a platform migration, like I talked about for us, you're not just adding some things, but you're actually trying to end up in mostly JavaScript in the end, then I think you need to be concerned at that point with basically, of your existing platforms, what does your feature set look like? And then what does your infrastructure look like? So essentially, this looks a bit more complicated than the previous slide, and that's okay. The takeaway is, if your existing application has a good foundation, it's well architected, then it doesn't really matter how troubling your feature set is, because doing that integration won't be so challenged. And once again, you'll be able to focus on the feature set, offsetting the cost of connecting your architectures. Now, if you have just a so-so, okay, kind of meh architecture, then I think you've got to be more concerned with how you fall into that gray area of maybe, but not quite definitely, I should do it. Where we saw this especially was more certain, though, was with people who needed to add more functionality to their applications. If you just have a garbage architecture, though, and your feature set isn't solid either, you're in a really troubling case. That's that bottom left, because essentially you don't have a good foundation on either side, and at the end of it, you're likely to end up with a ground-up rewrite anyway, plus all the challenges of integrating your feature set along the way. And so it's probably going to be more challenging than it's worth. But to be honest, in our case, we were somewhere in this bottom right-hand corner. So we were in questionable territory. The architecture really is that bad. I got one of my developers here who can vouch for that. But really it was the bonus points that I talked about 2 slides ago that pushed us over, where we said, this is really going to be worth it in the long run. And one of the other things that I didn't mention on the bonus points is doing Brownfield gave us an opportunity to start doing React in production. And so that got our organization experience working with React Native much faster than if we had tidied up the existing thing, continued to let it limp along, and did a completely new Greenfield. Now, there are a few additional factors I'd suggest for Brownfield migration cases in my last slide. First, are you able to bite off chunks of your customer journey so that way you could actually ship features of your application at a time? Because really, unless you're trying to reverse engineer an application and make sense of what's existing, like let's say you inherited something and there isn't any documentation, the real benefit of Brownfield is that you could do incremental releases as you go along. But if your customer journey is such a mess that you can't imagine segmenting things and saying, here's my data domain, here's my functionality and navigation domain, I can pull that out, put in the new, and release, if you can't do that, I'd question whether you actually are getting the benefit from doing Brownfield for a transformation purpose. And also, just remember that before you say, yeah, this is a good idea, you need to assess, are we set up to support a Brownfield application in production? Now, depending on your environment, that might mean that the same people who write the transformation are the same ones supporting it. And great, I'd suggest probably you're ready then. But in some other organizations, instead, they segment teams, and they'll say that you focus on application development, and you focus on supporting stuff in production. And just like I talked about before, make sure your business and the rest of your org understand you're working in JavaScript and doing Brownfield. That's especially a consideration once you ship something to production, because you don't want to be caught pushing code on a Friday and then having someone else over the weekend trying to make sense of what is all the stuff that showed up. So now that we've covered why we're doing Brownfield and why you might, I want to leave you with some advice from our own experiences. If you're going to do a Brownfield migration, you need to build a plan. And this isn't different from any other engineering problem, so it should come naturally. At a really, really high level, this is what our plan was. I'm going to walk you through it. First, my suggestion is that you focus on getting a low-risk UI element into production. That gives you a chance to get your tooling in place, get your teams comfortable, work through that socialization and making sure everyone understands what you're doing. And the biggest thing is this is the opportunity for you, without a ton of risk, to work on the foundation of your integration, how you glue those platforms together. This is the right time for you to start weighing what is good enough and helping define and getting comfortable, essentially, with not seeking perfection, but saying, what is the foundation that I need to support the phase of this transition that I'm doing? For us, we've had to revisit this a couple times, because as we have more code move from old legacy platform into React Native, our needs change for the way that that integration takes place. So my suggestion is from day one, focus on getting something out there, and then be prepared to iterate on it a couple times along the way. I mentioned before, there are a number of exciting changes coming with the bridge, but our implementation, we had to tame the bridge. So the next thing that we needed to work on was, what is our data sharing strategy? Because we had to, of course, flow data both ways. Essentially, if you combine native event emitters and native module callbacks, you can get data going in both directions. And we actually have APIs written on both sides, old legacy and new platform. And we're able to invoke both from the other direction. It works pretty well, but it can take a little bit of time to get right, and you've got to be careful too. And you can even use a similar approach to intertwine your states between your legacy application and your new stuff pretty well. I'll caution you, though, if you're trying to do that in something that requires on-the-fly updates of state when you're in the middle of, say, navigating or some other 60 FPS operation. Because remember, the bridge is asynchronous. So it's great for gluing state together, but you've got to be really careful about what your strategy is and when you need to access that state. And then remember that as you're flinging stuff back and across the bridge, you've got to be prepared to handle the life cycle of all of your platforms. Because essentially now you still own the Android lifecycle and the iOS lifecycle. But now you've got to be concerned also with the React Native lifecycle and how you glue all those things together since you've got some common code now. This will be really important to remember because it'll be tempting to say, well, I just get everything in React and everything's good, right? But you have all that legacy code you've got to contend with. And what happens if something gets halfway across the bridge and then you get sent to the background and then there's some memory pressure and yada, yada, yada. Let's just say for some reason it went one way but never came back. And then you get a crash maybe 5 minutes later. So just make certain that you spend the right amount of time trying to tame the bridge and that you thoroughly test this. And for us, that looked like a process that spanned more than a month, to be honest. Once again, it was incremental. That's okay. That's healthy. Now, once you have the platform implemented and released and a strategy for how you're doing data, then really you're in the bulk of the project, which is transitioning screens. And we found the best way to do this is essentially to draw a sitemap of your application. So make a graph of all the screens, maybe some of the alternate states for the screens, and try to define, what are the data boundaries, the navigation boundaries, the UX boundaries across those screens. And imagine where you bite off those chunks that I mentioned before. Because essentially that's going to be a portion of work that you could potentially release into production. And you want to build a strategy for how you're going to piecemeal pull those pieces over, so that way in the end, you can end up with that Greenfield-like solution, and then perhaps even go so far as to transition over your route and move navigation in too. And in this case, like I mentioned before, if you're doing piecemeal, you're going to have multiple React apps embedded across the legacy application, and that's okay. It might seem a little bit confusing though, and for some people, it could actually be quite hard. But if it is really hard for you, I'd suggest you need to take a serious look at your legacy work, or maybe at your feature set, and consider, is the challenge really that I'm doing React Native, and is it a limitation of React and React Native, or actually, is my legacy stuff maybe not done quite right, and pretty far from expectations for this platform? Because in our case, at least, we had to revamp navigation in our legacy applications before we could make significant progress on the Brownfield side. So step one of moving into React Native was changing our tab nav. Didn't really seem intuitive, but we had to do it in order to get to that feature at a time transition approach that we talked about. Now finally, remember that you still own the platforms, and React Native is opinionated about how those platforms should look. So even if you're lucky enough to avoid changes to your legacy platform, maybe you don't have to redo navigation like I talked about for us. You still own it though. And so that initial Brownfield implementation, getting that first feature into production, maybe that just takes a couple days if you're really well off, or maybe it takes a couple weeks. But along the life of your project, you're probably going to need to upgrade React Native. I'd suggest that your project takes more than just a couple of months. And you really want to stay up to date with latest React Native. But you're probably going to face some platform challenges along the way. You know, in 60 CocoaPods, anyway, Android X, anyway. So it could be challenging. You'll want to say, well, I'll leave that to the end, and 58's good enough for me. But remember that the challenges that React Native poses, Android X, CocoaPods, there's lots of things in the past. Those are just top of mind for me. Those are standards things. Those are things that you do in the legacy, even if you weren't doing Brownfield. So why are you putting them off? And if you do those changes, you get to take advantage of a lot of the great benefits. 61 is going to be coming soon, and you really, really want the developer experience benefits of 61. It speeds things up a lot. And since they're really changes that more likely than not you should have already been doing, absorb the changes, build it into your plan, and recognize that taking about a week every couple of months to stay up to date with React Native in your I wish I could throw it out legacy Brownfield project, it really is worth it in the end. So this morning I've successfully run through my presentation without showing you any code at all. But that doesn't mean that you should go and do Brownfield without. So here are a couple talks that I found really helpful when considering, hey, what are we doing with our Brownfield strategy? And there are a lot of other resources out there in the form of Medium posts and the actual React Native documentation themselves, tutorials. I'm not even really going to get into them, but my advice is don't start Brownfield until you look at the APIs and start to wrap your head around what would this actually look like. Now, I know that the decision-making system I presented is pretty complex. There were these weird filter questions and some bonus questions and then these continuums, and at the end of it, you were probably just scratching your head. And since this is an application conference, I figured let me give you an app to help you with your app. So check out the name of my talk, So You're Considering Brownfield.dev, on the web. And essentially, I've made a fun internet quiz that'll help you take the advice from my presentation today. And it's kind of like this BuzzFeed quiz saying, what kind of cheese are you? I'm brie. I don't know what that means, but hopefully my quiz gives you a little bit more meaningful and appreciable information. Essentially, it'll tell you what kind of a Brownfield fit I think you are based off of the criteria that I shared today. And it's supposed to look like garbage because that's just what internet quizzes look like. So sorry if this is a little foreign to folks over here. BuzzFeed must mostly be an American thing. Anyway, I'll make a suggestion. Are you meh? Definitely bad idea. Is it a good suggestion? Good idea? And then I'll also tell you what kind of a Stranger Things character you are. Use that website to remember that Brownfield really isn't scary. It's just another challenge. And it's another way to use React Native. We found it's a great fit for us at AutoZone, but ultimately, it's up to you to determine if the Brownfield is right for you. Thank you for having me this morning. Thanks, Mike. Back to you.